واشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني ويفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is Durkastan's second Halaqa. So today we have with us James Sinclair and Jibran. James Sinclair holds a master's degree in physics with a specialty in cosmology. He volunteers with Reasons to Believe and is the co-author of William Lane Craig's books on the Kalam Cosmological argument. Jibran studies philosophy at the University of Los Angeles, California, with his specialty being in metaphysics. The scope of it is going to be about, first, cosmological argument and what the premises are. That's going to be for about 5 minutes or so. Then, why the Kalam Cosmological argument is a useful argument. Objections to the Kalam Cosmological argument. After which, we're going to reply to those objections, and then after which, we're going to answer questions from the audience. Inshallah, we are going to introduce what the Kalam Cosmological argument is and the premises of the argument.
Alright, Assalamu alaikum everybody. So, the topic we'll be talking about is the Kalam Cosmological argument. And we have to understand the history of the argument before we can delve into it. Now, prior to the founder of the argument, Al-Ghazali, people believed the universe was eternal. And what was needed was more of a necessary cause that could sustain the eternal universe. Al-Ghazali, however, finds this to be a heretical belief, and he tries to propose an argument that he feels is a better argument for God's existence, and that is the Kalam Cosmological argument. Now, the premise of the Kalam is pretty simple. Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. Now, the argument has developed quite a bit since the time of Al-Ghazali, and generally what's been used to define both of the premises, premise one, where everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. In general, there's been two appeals to justification of premise one. One is that it's intuitive that something can't come out of nothing, right? It's generally, to us, absurd to believe in that. And the second justification is that A and Prior used, that if something could come out of nothing, then why don't other things come out of nothing, right? Because there's nothing to be constrained, right? Because nothing isn't something. And the second justification usually used to defend that the universe had a cause for its existence is that an actual infinite can't exist. And if an actual infinite were to exist, there would be certain absurdities. A modern example would be Benedard's book. Benedard asked, imagine if you had a book, right? And if there were a book with infinite pages, if you were to, for example, turn the page around, flip the book in half to the other side, and open the last page, there wouldn't be a last page. And so to avoid these absurdities, an actual infinite cannot actually exist. And I'll let Sinclair explain the scientific arguments in support of premise 2.
Actually, I'd like to ask you to maybe share your thoughts on the explanation of the Kalam Cosmological argument, like its history.
It's been defended by great scholars. I think all three Abrahamic faiths. We call it Coulomb because Al-Ghazali is recognized as the greatest contributor, I believe. So, I believe that there was a Christian contributor named John Philoponus who had a proto version of the argument, I think in the 4th or 5th century, but it wasn't completed the way that Al-Ghazali did. There was a Jewish scholar named Maimonides that spoke to it up to the present. But really, until William Lane Craig and the Seacoasters in the late 20th century picked it up, it had problematic use. And one of the main reasons for that is the discovery and development of the Big Bang Theory in cosmology, cosmology is a very young science. In fact, it wasn't even a respectable science until the 1960s, when people like Stephen Hawking and Roger and several people on the Russian side were also during the Soviet era. The development of the Big Bang theory and within Roman Catholicism in 1951, the Pope suggested that the Big Bang theory would support the existence of God. So that got a lot of popular attention. And so suddenly the idea that a temporal beginning to the universe a finite time ago suggested a creator was recognized both at popular levels, but also within cosmology itself. I think it might be useful to talk that there's generally three types of cosmological arguments. There's the Leibnizian type arguments, which deal with what's called the principle of sufficiency, that things require explanation, and you reach an end explanation in a metaphysically necessary God. So that has some advantages that Coulomb doesn't, but it can be more difficult to argue. And there's also Thomistic arguments, which directly access and come from Aristotelian Thomistic ontology. Of course, Thomas Aquinas borrowed heavily a lot of Islamic scholars because they had saved a lot of the ancient Greek speculations on God and Aristotle and all that. So there was a lot of interaction in that era between the Christian and Muslim worlds. And there is today also on these arguments. But one of the real strengths of Coulomb, I believe, is because people can have an intuitive idea that there's a temporal beginning to the universe appears to imply a creator. Unless universes can just pop into being from nothing. And if you like, actually, let me lay out a little bit of the way that I think about the argument, which is it's not too different. But I tend to put arguments about actual infinity and things like that strictly in the second premise. So the first premise is totally about causation. Is there a causal principle? Does it apply outside or transcendent to the universe? And it's totally a metaphysical principle. Studies within physics itself are superseded by the metaphysics. That's something that a lot of physicists don't understand. That physics actually operates within rules that are written by metaphysics. And so the second premise is broken into two parts. One is, does the universe have a beginning? But you notice that the second premise actually reads, did the universe began to exist? So began to exist and has a beginning are not completely equivalent statements, because in there you bring in a philosophy of time. Okay. And to try to sum up quickly, there's two competitors for the philosophy of time, which are generally called the tensed and the tenseless. So the tensed version of time is that there really is an objective now, that there is a present. So when I say, when I talk about the present, or I talk about I'm here now, I'm making a tense statement. While the opposite idea is called the tenseless theory of time, which says that there is really no objective present that exists, that that's just a social construction or something that we have through language, and that the universe exists, or really subsists as a block entity that has eternality all by itself. And if I want to refer to a particular time, I have to say 3 o'clock on Friday, December 26th, 1980 or something like that. I have to specifically refer temporally and objectively to that instant. I can't say something like 5 minutes ago or 3 minutes in the future. And the Coulomb argument runs first to last on a tensed period of time. Okay. So when we start talking about objections, that is probably the best place to focus. Although I think we want to talk about specifically some of the objections that Ali had, the guest who's going to be. So the contribution that I make is, does the universe have a beginning? Now, this is where when William Lane Craig deals with it, he makes 3 arguments in favor of the beginning, and 2 of them are philosophy-based, and they have to do with this idea of the actual infinity, which Jibran mentioned a little bit. And so those 2 arguments are, one, the impossibility of the actual infinite. I believe you mentioned that one. The other is the inability to traverse an actual infinite.
Inability to what, sorry?
Traverse an actual infinite. For example, Bill Craig often gives what's called the tale of Tristram Shandy, who wants to write his biography. And it takes him a week to write about every day of his life. So the longer he writes, the further he falls behind. So the question is, how in the heck did he ever finish the biography, even if he could live eternally? So you get into dilemmas like that. And the third argument is specifically the modern cosmology, that does the Big Bang theory hold up? Is there a temporal beginning? And then finally, the third premise would be so the first premise, that which begins to exist must have a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist. Then you get to the third premise, therefore, the universe began to exist. And it must have a cause. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Okay? And then the third premise, the discussion within that would be, who is the cause? So I'd say the simple Coulomb argument leaves it right there. When you go beyond that, you can discuss various corollaries about who the cause is. And different cosmological arguments have different strengths about identifying. Different cosmological arguments have different strengths about identifying exactly who the cause is. Now, one thing that's very powerful about all of the cosmological, but also Coulomb is in there, is that it's clear that this cause, whatever it is, transcends. And that's a more powerful statement than just talking about location. Okay? You're making a statement about ontology. Ontology of this entity transcends itself. It's not embodied within the universe. It's ontologically superior to it. And that is the main power, I think, of the Coulomb argument, is bringing a person to that realization. There's some entity which transcends the material universe. Therefore, the idea that just the material, a monistic ontology, that the material entities, whatever they are, atoms, doesn't seem true, because there has to be something beyond that that's brought into being.
Just for the listeners to hear this, but this specific phrase, you were mentioning that there was something called a Thomistic argument?
Yeah, Thomistic, yeah.
How would you spell that?
Thomis.
Oh, like Thomas.
So Thomas, he wrote the book called the Summa. which had 5 arguments. The thing about that is that it's very hard to understand that his arguments are totally in the context of Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics. See, we growing up in the 21st century, we're used to being taught a Cartesian idea where the only thing that exists is efficient causes and they act on atoms, or the fields act things. And so we're used to this atomistic, materialistic idea of what ontology is. And that can make it difficult to understand the Thomistic argument. Even though if you do understand it, it can be a stronger argument. It's a ground of being argument. Thomistic argument is not strictly that there's a first cause. It's really, the Thomistic argument could work even in a past eternal, meaningless universe. What that says is that God holds the universe in his hand and maintains being. Without God, it would disappear.
What's the other type of argument that you mentioned? There was the Thomistic argument.
Yeah, and the other type was Leibniz's God, which has to do with explanation.
How would you spell Leibniz?
I think it's Liebniz. I always misspell it and have to go to Google. I think it's Liebniz. Yeah, and
so are there any other types of Kalam cosmological arguments or variations of it?
I believe those are the 3, along with the temporal, the implications of a temporal beginning.
The last one is the temporal one?
Yeah, that'd be the Coulomb type. Would be the 3rd type. And so in terms of strength, I think the Coulomb it's more intuitive for people in the modern age who they have this Cartesian idea of metaphysics, which is basically modernism, or material. Okay, so it's easier to argue directly from sciences, and that doesn't mean that from a fact-based perspective, Coulomb is superior to the other types. I'm just saying I think it's easier for people to access and understand.
You're saying the strengths of the Kalam cosmological argument is that it's good for people who live in a society in which materialism is adopted.
It's more closer. Yeah. Imagine somebody who's brought up without any religion at all, and they're just brought up in some kind of atheist rubric, but they're very big on science and things, like science is taught in university. And that's basically a Cartesian world with except you excise the soul. But so trying to explain to that person the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas would be very difficult. So that's one of the reasons I was myself in the beginning to the Coulomb art, that it has this power of showing you God, and it does it in a way which is aligned very well with modern cosmology. So you'll notice that every cosmologist gains prominence, immediately goes out and writes a book and so on. And you want to know why that is? It's because public has an intuition that cosmology is talking about God, talking about God as creator. And so cosmologists, they're in a purely secular sense, they'd be like modern day priests. You know what I'm trying to get at. The public puts cosmologists in almost like modern day priests, which talk to God, but in a secular sense. And So that is a sign that some evidence for the idea that if we get in and start talking about what does cosmology actually say about time, and Coulomb is the framework. Coulomb is more than 1,000 years old. Or no, if you go back to Coulomb, go back to Ghazali, it's still, and so it's just really interesting to have this framework that we're resonating with these great thinkers down through the century, and they've given us the framework to think of John today and fulfill it. And in my case, back when I picked this up, which was in the mid '90s, it didn't seem like anyone else was doing it. Except now I'm only familiar with the Christian. It's only now that through Twitter and through invitations like one you gave me that getting a chance to interface with the Muslim community, which I think is fabulous. I love this opportunity to be able to talk with you about this. But in my case, I became aware of a ministry called Reason to Believe, California ministry. Hugh Ross, astrophysicist, he had a form of this argument, and he would use what was called a singularity theory from these great cosmologists, Stephen Hawking, heroes. And he would say, hey, these guys proved in 1970 that the universe has a beginning. And so immediately my reaction was that. And I'll bet that the kinds of people who are listening to this podcast today are a self-selected group that I bet if we did a Myers-Briggs personality profile on most of the people who are listening today, you're of the type that would say, that's great, but I don't quite trust it. I want to go out there and test. You're the testing type. And that's how I started it. I said, well, it's cosmology. It's not rocket science. It's not that hard. That's a joke. That's a joke. So right at that time, they could get access to all the different papers that would be published. So that's what I started doing. I started interacting through email with a lot of the leading cosmologists. And so that's how I got started.
Did you start at a time in which I know the Big Bang, for example, is, I'll save this as a question for the end. I want to move on to Jibran. Why, in your opinion, is the Kalam Cosmological argument a useful argument that Muslims should know about?
Well, part of the benefit in the Kalam Cosmological argument is there is somewhat of a Islamic history behind it, right? Like we can look, for example, at Aristotelian arguments, but those were more Western. The advantage that the Coulomb kind of has for Muslims is that it allows people to have access to their own tradition, right? Looking at how have Muslims argued for God's existence, and this argument is a great introduction to Islamic philosophy and how Islam approaches other philosophical questions. Another advantage what I like about the Kalam is that it has probably the most support, I think, than any other argument in the last couple advancements in science, mathematics, and philosophy. Quentin Smith himself comments that there are more papers published on the Kalam than any other argument for God's existence. And I think that itself is a testament to its strength, because in academia, right? If an argument's just bad, nobody's going to bother with it. But if you have a good argument, then there's going to be discussions going for it. And another thing I like about the Coulomb is that it approaches so many different aspects of philosophy. It affects philosophy of time. It reflects, how do you view mathematics, the ontology of mathematical objects in mathematics itself? How can we understand, libertarian will and other aspects is like that? And so, the argument is so simple, but it's one of the few arguments you could literally build your entire career off of it because it's so multifaceted. And once you understand the intricacies, you get a greater appreciation to the beauty of it. That a two premise argument can have so much to talk about.
Yeah, subhanAllah. Actually, this argument, this one was the first argument that I learned when I started learning how to do dawah. So it's kind of personal for me as well. Now that, do you think that we've explained it enough what the Kalam Cosmological argument is?
We explained how, three main arguments for why the universe is beginning. Well, if we accept infinities, we have paradoxes. Second is, of course, if, you can't reach an infinity by adding it up all the way to infinity, right? Like Sinclair made with the Tristram Shandy paradox. And he also mentioned, recently, modern cosmogony and cosmology have greatly supported the Kalam cosmological argument.
It wasn't always the case that the Big Bang was widely accepted like this, right? Wasn't it like maybe 50, 60 years ago? Maybe James can elaborate on this, that in the past it wasn't always such that the scientists believed that the universe had a beginning.
Yeah, it's actually fairly recent. Because, modern cosmology probably starts with Albert Einstein in somewhere around 1915 to 17 when he was working on general relativity. And he put his equations together, attempted to apply them to the entire universe, and they appeared to show that the universe does not have a steady state, which is what was believed. The idea, not that the universe is eternal, but it's static, it's in a steady state condition. Rather, his equations predicted that the universe is either expanding or contracting, and he simply didn't believe it. So he created an extra term for the equation, which was consistent with his equations, called the Cosmological Constant, which has an interesting history because by putting that term in the equation, it allowed the forces that it allowed it canceled out. It allowed an equilibrium between the expansion and the contraction, so you get a steady state. And however, it was quickly pointed out to him, not long after that balance itself was unstable to perturbation. So it really wasn't a good model of the universe. And you got two other cosmologists, one named Friedman, another named Lemaitre, who independently came up with the idea of the expanding universe, and that it did have a finite beginning to it. And these other cosmologists, and another, even up to present one colleague, named Narlik, forget his first name. They would they would try to rehabilitate the idea of the steady state model. And a couple of developments, one in the 60s all the way up, and then one when they found accidentally there were two scientists named Arnold Penzias and Wilson, who discovered that the universe has a background radiation. you can talk about it in terms of a temperature of about 3 degrees above absolute zero, which is a prediction that would make no sense at all in a steady state universe. But in a Big Bang universe, or especially a hot Big Bang universe, which starts off very hot and then as it expands, it goes down, it makes perfect sense that there would be a bath of radiation left over. The other discoveries from the late 1990s to the present, where they're measuring this cosmic background radiation directly through the WMAP and other satellites, all the way to the Planck satellite. There's a couple of them. By measuring this directly, it tended to match predictions from the Big Bang. Also, predictions of what the elemental composition of the universe should look like. In the early universe, the relative quantities of simple elements like hydrogen, helium, and lithium. The Big Bang Theory makes predictions about what those quantities, the relative ratio of those quantities should be, and it's borne out almost perfectly. The Big Bang keeps hitting all these predictions, and with the steady state idea, you get to a situation where you might be able to rehabilitate theory by making it more and more complex over time to try to accommodate all these new observations. But within philosophy of science, it's one of the postulates that we follow is the idea of simplicity tends to leading you toward truth. It's almost like the old theory, the Ptolemaic theory, that everything revolves around the Earth as opposed to the heliocentric. The Ptolemaic theory worked perfectly well. It was just extremely complex. And every time you saw these really complicated movements of the planets, you had to add things to your theory, which made it look like it was jury-rigged. But the theory worked great. Okay, what led us to the heliocentric theory is that it was so simple. It just had the mark of truth to it. And something similar applies for the development, the acceptance of the Big Bang from the 60s up through the 90s. And you have Stephen Hawking saying, I think in 96, he wrote a book with Penrose, and he commented that everybody believes the Big Bang theory. It doesn't mean that they believe that the universe was finite necessarily. They believe in the Big Bang. We can get into the objections section later if you'd like.
Did you want to add anything?
I mean, I remember listening to the Coulomb-Russell debate, and traditionally atheists have tried to argue that the logic of the argument is sound, but they would usually appeal to the universe as being the necessary thing that sustains reality. I think the Big Bang cosmology, at least, directly refutes that claim. At least the universe is necessary, since we do know that the universe, at least how we've seen it, hasn't always been that way. It's contingent. It could or could not have existed. Which, I would have really loved to see what Russell would say now. Sadly, we can't.
What do you mean by the universe is contingent?
Contingent as in it could or could not exist. I mean, since the universe it began to exist, right? It has a contingent explanation. It has something that caused it to exist.
Do we jump into the objections to the argument now?
Sure.
So, one of the speakers who was supposed to come today, Niro Maliki, he made a whole Twitter thread on to the Kalam Cosmological argument. And the first one, which is the argument relies too much on the principle of sufficient reason, right? I'll just read it straight from what he wrote. There has to be a reason for every fact. Like, for example, if I have a heart attack, there has to be a reason why I have a heart attack, okay? And the second premise is, for every x, there is a y, and such that y is the sufficient explanation. So in summary, every fact has a reason, and that reason is explainable, is understandable, and can be communicated.
I mean, to me, I would object to that by claiming that the individual itself doesn't understand the basis on which premise one of the Coulomb is based off of. PSR can support premise one of the Coulomb, but Coulomb does not need the PSR to work. The Coulomb operates on the basis that anything that begins to exist has a cause for existence. So, say for example, there was an atom that existed for eternally. Premise one of the Coulomb wouldn't work under that circumstance. It operates on the basis that if something has temporal becoming, or if it has began to exist, right, there needs to be an explanation outside of it for its explanation. So, the example you gave of a heart attack, right? Suppose that person had always existed for eternally and he had a heart attack. Premise one of the Coulomb doesn't require or affect that fact, the fact that it happened.
Are you getting at, let's see if I understand your point, Jibran. Just so I like your argument. You could say the fact that something else over here might be past eternal, that has nothing to do with my universe. My universe has a beginning in the finite past. Then it must have a cause of its existence. So it doesn't matter if there's 18 eternal universes over here. If we show that this universe that we look, the only thing that's relevant is what's going on with our universe. Or am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
No, my argument is more that the PSR is a bit more encompassing than what premise one of the Coulomb is working off of. So the premise one of the Coulomb isn't stating that every contingent fact needs an explanation, in the sense that any event requires an explanation for why it exists. It's just arguing that for a very specific event, and that event is temporal becoming, right? So, for example, somebody having a heart attack, that individual itself doesn't have a temporal becoming, right? So, premise, you can reject PSR, but you could still fall under premise one of the Coulomb. Does that help explain it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think have you developed that idea anywhere else? Or have you written on that?
I haven't written on that, but I plan on it.
Okay. Yeah, well, you can see how I deal with the issue on my Twitter site. And if you just look for Sinclair and Coulomb, you'll find me. And my pinned tweet has 5 or 6.
I mean, the best way I can explain it is that, like, think of it like cats and animals, right? All cats are animals, but not all animals are cats, right? So all things that begin to exist would fall under PSR, right? But not every event would fall under premise one of the Coulomb.
Yeah, you could argue that. And actually, the way that I like to defend the first premise, which is actually different than the way William Lane Craig does, is I like to turn the situation on its head. Now I'm thinking about the modern audience that I'm addressing, okay, which is usually a science-savvy audience. You know, if I'm talking to an atheist, for example, atheism doesn't have to embrace scientism, but in the modern day, it generally does. So the way that I like to approach it is, so what would happen if the PSR wasn't true? And things could just pop into being. Well, first of all, you said it in your introduction that by definition, this is an unconstrained, there's no rules attached to this. Okay, if things can pop into being, then they can be anything. Okay, because we're saying something comes from nothing, and we're real serious about nothing. Unlike Lawrence Krauss, a cosmologist who wrote a whole book on the top, and I think still doesn't get what theists mean when we talk about nothing. Okay, no, we're serious. There are no constraints, no rules. That's one of the reasons why, the quantum objection I have a problem with, because quantum definitely has rules attached to it, probability distributions, things like that. So, what does that imply about the ability to do something if processes like that exist? It means that if I'm in a laboratory and I'm trying to do experiments, and there's other laboratories that are trying to repeat my experiments, that's impossible, because any of the phenomena that I'm trying to observe, it might be actual physics and some kind of evolutionary, and I'm using evolution in a larger sense, forces acting on particles or fields or things like that. So we're observing. But meanwhile, let's say that that's all true, that there are forces and things like that going on. And I'm trying very hard to detect that and discover what laws of physics are. And meanwhile, there's this interference from these things that just happen for no reason at all. And they could be anything. It could be the production of universe, the production of pink elephants. It could be the disappearance of things. Okay? It is a very important thing about this is that because no probability distribution attaches to those events, every event that ever happened in the universe might be one of those events. And it's not correct to say that that's improbable or unlikely. So what that means is that there's no scientific induction, can't do science. So you can be a dedicated true skeptic and deny the first premise, but if you do, then you have to throw out and be an atheist who embraces science. And I think that that's a very unattractive position, especially in the modern day. And I find that to be a productive way to argue in favor of the first premise.
But then people could give the example that, okay, so say the universe doesn't need a cause because, well, other things in reality that don't need causes as well. Okay, so for example, quantum physics, like things just appearing out of nothing. Like what isn't that what Lawrence Krauss argues, that like there's a what could explain this, like a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum?
Well, that's one of the things, Gus. But in that case, not starting with nothing. In that case, why don't we talk about the objection? Although actually, I was supposed to play the red team. I was supposed to bring those objections over against you. but let me tell you what I think about it. First of all, we're talking about universes and action. You're talking about this idea that particles just pop into being in quantum physics. But first of all, you're only talking about simple quantum physics, not quantum gravity. Okay, so the big overarching quantum gravity that would have to apply there is a completely different theory. Okay, the second thing that I would say is that there's at least 4. Go look in Wikipedia or other sources. And they list up to 17 different interpretations of what quantum mechanics is. And the only one that really you might infer that particles pop into being is what's called the Copenhagen interpretation. And most of these interpretations are deterministic. Okay.
They're deterministic?
They're deterministic. You don't have supposedly intrinsically random events that occur. The next thing I would say about it is that it assumes the reality of particles. Well, okay, now let me talk about over to my actual career for a second. What I do is I'm a modeler. Okay, so
You're a what, sorry?
I'm a modeler. I'm a modeler. So, yeah, modeler. When you build models always have limitations, and they aren't necessarily, and they could be instrumental, which means you're not necessarily, which means pragmatic. It works. It'll make good predictions, but you don't believe what it predicts about the ontology of the universe. And there's other models that you are trying to represent what you think the ontology actually looks like. Like, for example, in quantum field theory, there are no particles, there's fields. Like, think of it like a spider web that vibrates. Okay, and a vibration, that's what a particle, that's the thing which in another ontology, we would call a particle. It takes saying that particles come into being takes too seriously the idea of particle. I mean, when you go down deeper and deeper into physics and look and you say, well, what actually are these things that we're looking at? You don't end up with, it's almost like holding water in your hands if you want to call it a particle. It gets more and more difficult to say that that's what it is. That was my reaction back at university, learning what was being said about quote unquote particle physics. So I would question the oversimplicity, the naive simplicity of the ontology of the person who says, oh, particles just pop into being, and therefore the range of events happen. So, there's three arguments right there that I've given for why I really don't think that that's a good objection.
Would you also say that pointing to quantum fluctuations is an example of an argument from ignorance? That just because there appears to not be a cause doesn't mean an actual cause.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use that language because it's kind of pejorative. What I'm saying is that people this is the thing that resonates with the public because this is the ontology that people taught under materialism, that there's particles and the things that act on. And in fact, we have no idea what the actual what an electron actually is, for example. Okay, we have various ontologies that we've built, and we have what if you've ever read the books by John Gribben on quantum mechanics. There's two ways that we think about quantum mechanics. One is we have a toolkit which is unbelievable at making predictions. It just does great. Okay, but when we try to explain what the actual physics, what the actual reality of what the entities in the toolkit are, we have no idea. And hence the 4 or the 17 different interpretations, most of which don't have entities that pop into being out of nothing in their ontology anyway. So, as I said, I think when you look into it, the quantum objection is not very serious. The best argument is when you go to quantum gravity itself. You have I think, a completely different theory. And when you look at what happens when you put one of the things I do when if you're familiar with a debate that takes place every year called Greer-Hurd, where you usually have a team of Christians who are debating on some topic or another. Is intelligent design theory all it's cracked up to be, or is evolution true, or can we believe the Bible, or something like that? Well, one year they had a talk on what does cosmology say about God, and they invited William Lane Craig to be the main speaker, and he invited me to be on his team. Okay, so I put together a presentation, which is online, by the way. If you look for Gray Herd 2014, and then just Google, James Sinclair or something, you'll find the talk that I gave. And the talk was entirely about uh, different approaches to quantum gravity in cosmology and what they say about temporal beginnings of the universe. But it also would relate back to this other question. Also, I think that those models actually beautifully show a creation ex nihilo myself. And so I thought Stephen Hawking, he's my hero, and Vilenkin independently. By the way, if you're familiar with this topic, you know that Vilenkin tends to be known as the cosmologist who is friendly to the theist because we invoke him all the time. Well, the reason that he keeps coming up with these theories, which are compatible with, here's what I think is true. The reason that he has an incentive to show that quantum gravity or theories under general relativity separately reach back to a temporal beginning is because he has a competing theory with Stephen Hawking's quantum gravity theory, which shows the universe coming into being itself. And I mean, that's an objection that we could follow further if you like. But I should throw this back. I should throw this back on Jibran. I say, Jibran, suppose I say that as an objection. Well, why can't quantum gravity be the creator instead of God? This is what the kind of thing that you may hear from a Lawrence Krauss. And actually, I'm interested in what your reply would be to that.
Right. Generally, what is defined the Kalam Cosmological by universe is space-time and matter. Matter in all space-time, basically. And so, since the universe itself has cause, we know that space-time and matter itself has an explanation for existence. So, what happens usually is that many atheists, they try to object to the argument saying that, well, the universe as we know it, but the argument isn't about, well, the universe as we know it. It's about all of space, time, and matter, right? So if there is some explanation that requires some kind of space, time, and matter, there needs to be, then you can argue that that might be in the universe. But that's not what we're really arguing. But second of all, the argument doesn't just end at, well, the universe is cause for existence. I know Craig himself gives three arguments as to why the universe needs to have conscious creation, right? And, one of the arguments he gives is, for example, well, there's two possible explanations. One is, physical explanations, and then there are agent explanations, right? And, there can't be a physical explanation because there is no physical state. Second argument is that, well, since we know that the cause of the universe is, timeless, immaterial, extremely powerful, immutable, in all of philosophy, there are really only two concepts that fit that criteria, and that is an abstract object and a disembodied mind. Now, we know it can't be an abstract object because abstract objects are causally inert. They don't have any power, right? Number 5 doesn't have any power in the real world. It can't cause the universe, so it must be a disembodied mind. And the third argument is one Al-Ghazali uses, in that if you have, you can't explain an eternal cause with an finite effect through any physical explanation. Because if the cause is sufficient to cause the universe, then why doesn't the universe exist eternally, right? But if the cause is insufficient to cause the universe, then why does the universe exist? There must be some other explanation. So these are the arguments that I would personally give explanation why we should give a personal cause over a physical cause.
Yeah. I think William Lane Craig uses the example of imagine a man seated in a chair from all past eternity, and then suddenly he stands up. Okay, well, how does that happen? It has to be an agent explanation, because otherwise the question, this is what Al-Ghazali, he said, well, why did it happen then? Why didn't it happen at some other time? If you imagine that time is past eternal. Yeah, so you got me. I agree with you on that. I believe, along with William Lane, that there is a good sign there of an agent, that you need an agent explanation, even in a cosmological argument. Although I would add to that, today you're just talking about Coulomb for simplicity's sake, but there are other arguments that would also tend to show personhood in the creator. For example, the fine tuning of the cosmic design argument. Maybe at some other time you'd want to talk about those. But okay, let me throw another objection at you that Ali had. What good here's one of the, I believe that he said this. He said, well, what good are these arguments if you need to be a PhD in cosmology in order to understand them? How are you going to take them and approach the public when you need all these specialized forms of knowledge? What would you? So that now this is an objection to the usefulness of the argument, not the success of the argument.
Okay, I mean, my main objection was that, well, let's say, for example, the argument, I'm not aware of any single argument for God's existence that when you get into the nitty-gritty details, you need to have a very solid understanding of some very advanced concepts. And that's true with any argument or any controversial argument in philosophy, because he doesn't really throw an alternative out.
My take on if I had to classify all these objections overall, they have to do with the idea of certainty, that there's still uncertainty associated with whether the conclusion follows from the premises. You don't have metaphysical certainty. You've got good arguments for the premises, but it's not metaphysical certainty. So we can't quite get there. So that's one type of argument that Ali gives, and the other is this one about the difficulty. And at my Twitter site, I put at the top of my just below my pinned tweet a response that I gave to Ali. I think Ali and me are good friends now, by the way. We've interacted since last June when I started getting involved again in doing this, and he's just great. And so he's a good foil for the Coulomb argument. I think he probably actually supports it. But he's having this reaction, this natural reaction that you have. He says, yeah, but what I want it to be is metaphysically certain and easy to do. And it just isn't. But imagine if you had an argument that was like that. I mean, that would produce coercion and belief from God. And I don't think God coerces belief. So I would not expect the arguments to reach metaphysical certainty. And it's the other mistake that we make, when I got involved in apologetics, is especially if you have a scientific mind, which I'll bet this 75% of this audience probably, if you did a Myers-Briggs test, you probably like that because you're self-selective, is as soon as you say, hey, some of these arguments for God's existence are actually pretty good. And then what you want to do is master all of them, which is impossible. Okay. Even if you had the intellect of an Einstein, you couldn't do it. But you know what? It's not necessary. It's not necessary, for example, for me to become an expert on the origin of life, say. Okay. even though I started reading books on it, because that's a fine argument as well for a creation event. In that case, it's the creation of life. Okay. So what we can do, though, is establish teams of people.
I mean,
their arguments. And
another objection I would give is that what does he mean by certainty? Is he talking about like Descartesian certainty, or he's asking that a knowledge has to be certain in such that that knowledge has to be infallible? Well, I mean, I could just appeal to David Hume, where Hume said, you can't be metaphysically certain that the sun will rise tomorrow. But is that really a reason to not believe that the sun will rise tomorrow?
Well, probably not being fair to him by saying that he demands certainty. You'd probably object to that.
The thing is, Wittgenstein, I like his definition of certainty in the sense that a knowledge is certain in the sense that we don't have any reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and Wittgenstein is not one of my favorite philosophers, but he's the one who tries to say everything is just language and semantics and all that, which I really disagree with. But I like what Richard Feynman said, the great scientist. He said science is a culture of doubt, and then imagine our two. I include all the Abraham. Okay. So what do we mean by what Feynman said is that science is a culture of doubt, one of his quotes, and belief in God is a culture of faith. And I think what he was trying to do is say that the things aren't compatible, and I don't agree with it. Because I don't believe that it's or Christian teaching that the way that you come to belief in God through these arguments. What William Lane Craig would say is that the arguments have a ministerial rather than a magisterial role. Okay, so what a Christian would say is that we were talking tonight about this. We're talking about the idea of properly basic belief. That God Himself will grant faith. That's the magisterial role. But there are many, at a ministerial level, there are many uses for these arguments. But what you cannot use for is to coerce people into belief. One of the things that I replied to Ali is that we have this really interesting idea that the way that the intellect works is that we're disinterested observers, and we hear evidence and we apply logic to them and we come to conclusions, and that's how beliefs are formed. And it turns out that in none of our belief systems, whether it's atheism, Islam, or Christianity, is that taught. So it's really fascinating because you take atheism, for example, which is supposed to be atheists view that as the perfect science and scientism. And yet in atheism, what we're constantly taught is that the mind, it either doesn't exist because you've got, in that case, if you're a pure eliminated materialist, and some who believe that, or they believe that the mind exists, but it's some kind of, the term for it is epiphenomenalism, that it's an emergent phenomenon that supposes that, here's the term, supervenes. And you're a philosopher, so supervene is very supervene means, what it really means is that it doesn't really exist. Okay, it's dependent on other things. So there is such a thing as the mind. It is an immaterial thing, but it has no causal powers. And so if that's true, then under atheism, Victor Reppert wrote a great book on where he reprised C.S. Lewis's argument on whether simple logical reasoning is compatible with atheism, and it isn't. Okay, so it doesn't doesn't happen there. We don't have this interested discussion that happens about these arguments and whether they're true or not in atheism, because we don't think. There is no thinking. Or if there is, it's this epiphenomenal phenomenon that has nothing to do with actual the universe. It just supervenes on the physical. Okay, but we've already talked a little bit. How do we actually come to faith in God? And I know that St. Augustine did say that it could be very helpful. In Christian tradition, St. Augustine said that most people who come to God come there through the shipwreck of their soul. That it's like there's no way that they're going to turn away from sin until absolutely everything in their life is taken away from them. And finally they look toward God and they embrace God. Okay? But there's a few people who might, who are at least open to the argument. It's because God himself, and I was thinking about what you said last night in our pre-conversation. There's this philosopher named Alvin Planck, I think he's at Notre Dame. He's at Notre Dame, right? Who argued that there are also beliefs which are properly basic, and that could, we can both under Islam and Christianity just reference God and say God gives us this properly basic belief. In Christianity, you say the Holy Spirit, and so that's what gets us over the hump. Okay, so I guess what I'm doing is I'm undercutting the objection up front. I'm saying that this isn't how people actually think. It's not. We are capable of rational thought and premises and arguments and come into belief, but that's not how people come to belief. This is what I call putting aside the epistemic fog. Okay, let's put aside the epistemic fog and say if Islam is true, what does it say about rational thought? If Christianity is true, what does it say? If atheism is true, what does it say? If some fourth thing is true, what does it say? Okay, and often you can reach conclusions that you can't reach when you're operating under the epistemic fog and saying, I don't know what's true. And this overall idea of strict certainty, we need, I'd like to have certainty. It'd be very helpful. But the idea that coming to God, that it works that way, just doesn't seem to be true in any of the systems.
Yeah, I mean, generally, theists are people who, they themselves have probably never heard of any of the arguments for God's existence, and probably do hear a lot of arguments against God, but nobody's really been convinced, or at least, theists aren't convinced by him, even given the fact that, they're so well distributed.
So one of the things that I told Ollie, talked to him on Twitter, let's see, senior moment, I just forgot the question. Let's see if I can remember what I was going to say.
I mean, we're talking about how people, most people haven't even heard of the arguments for God's existence or know it in depth. And even though given how widely distributed atheistic material is, many people aren't convinced, right? Perhaps, it's based on some non-propositional evidence, right? Maybe a religious experience or something like that is more powerful than any argument.
Yeah, that's actually true. My own wife, if you asked her why she believes in God, what she will say. So she doesn't need all these arguments. Okay. What I'd say, I think a lot of this applies to Islam, but I'm speaking within a Christian context. Okay, yes, the arguments do apply in reaching out to non-believers. What it says in the Bible is that we are called to It's 1 Peter 3:15. We are called to be capable. Every Christian actually is required to be able to give an answer for why they have the things they have. While that's true, though, if you ask my wife, she'll say, I had a religious experience when I was 12 years old, and it was very powerful for me. I came to believe, and I don't need all these arguments. And my daughters tend to be that way also. Although my youngest daughter won't be. We'll see where she ends up. She's only 12 right now. My older children, they simply don't need that. And it's strange. I wonder if there's this thing, I don't want to show disrespect to academia, but to really believe something strange and absurd, you have to have a PhD. Once you actually start to consider and you try to open your mind to every possible thing that could, it's actually a lot of people in this self-selected group. When you think of every possible objection, let's think of every possible objection to every argument that we could have. Let's spend the rest of our lives tracking them down. That can lead to a lot of unnecessary doubt. There's a lot of really wacky things, like just read the Lawrence Krauss book, that people come to believe about metaphysics, that you have to do a PhD to even get there. So what I'm saying is the kind of group that we're within right now are people that are vulnerable to doubt that most people aren't. So you know what we need? We need the argument to help. I say that the first audience for the argument is actually us. The second argument, I'd say, is within our faith community. Okay? Because you're talking there to the people who God has opened up to the intellect. Okay? And so this is the ministerial role that William Lane Craig is talking about. And especially when you live in a Western society which is atheist dominated these days, when you're just bombarded every single day, heck, just read the frame. There's going to be next week. I'm sure there'll be some model that's proposed of the universe where it's half eternal, and they'll have some wacky justification for why that is. And by the way, the ministry that I belong to, Reasons to Believe, this is most of what they do. Is they respond to these crises of the week that come up and say, oh no, they disproved the Coulomb argument. There's some wacky explanation for how you can get to a singularity. The singularity doesn't exist or something like that. And you know what happens to all of these crises of the week? They quietly go away. They're not, 99% of them get rejected by the scientific community, and you never hear from them. Okay, so it's actually us people in the intellectual community that we actually have more of a need for these arguments for ourselves than most of the people in our faith community. But the people in the faith community, when they're bombarded daily by all this, especially our children, and the institutional atheism is just coming at them from all directions, they need to know that the resources exist that show their faith is true. And that's what we're for there. So I'd say that's the second reason. That's the second audience, is our faith community. Not everybody needs to go get a PhD in cosmology and understand this Coulomb argument. But somebody has to do it. And the people in our faith communities have to know that those resources exist and know where to find them if they need. And that would be my reply to Ali on that.
Yeah, in Islam, the responsibility of doing apologetics is actually more of a communal obligation, meaning that it's obligated that somebody in the community be engaged, though, but it's not, or apologetics, but it's not responsibility for every single individual, right? So, I mean, it is necessary that we do have people, right, who is, going through, the empirical data and trying to understand it through his own paradigm, rather than being the theistic worldview.
Yeah, you broke up for part of that, so I didn't fully understand where you were coming from.
I would say that in Islam, what's necessary is that there's a communal obligation that one member in the community has to be engaged in all of this, right? So even from like an Islamic perspective, it's not necessary that every single person understand, all the arguments for God's existence, right? Perhaps it might be sufficient to him that, could be religious experience, or could be some way his cognitive faculties are function in a way that he comes to this belief, right? Because what you consider rational is very dependent on your philosophy. That's something outlining and focuses quite a lot. Where the truth of Islam, the truth of Christianity, is not separated from the rationality of it.
No, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, it's not true. So you don't have to be worried about the fact that you have to have a PhD in this or that in order to understand. These arguments. The Coulomb, another way of thinking, the Coulomb is an argument to read the three premises. It's very simple, and anybody can grasp it. It's the way the pastor in my church used to describe the Gospel of John. He would say, when you're reading this book, you can go in and you can just splash around for a while, and it'll be very useful and satisfying. Or you could spend your whole life just on this one book. There's so much depth to it. So that's kind of what is true of these arguments also. And so I find them very satisfying also. This is what I do in my spare time. If I go to a dinner party and somebody says, "What's your hobby? Do you go hunting and fishing? Or do you like to refurbish old cars, rebuild old cars?" I say, "No, I research arguments for the existence of God." And that's either a conversation starter or a stopper. But I do it because I also do it because I enjoy it. But I picked up on it because I didn't see anyone else doing it at the time and the depth that it needed to be done. I'm not picking on William Lane Craig here. He tries to do everything, so he's fabulous. But I saw that who's always picking up the cosmology on the Christian side, using and bubble. I'm doing it. I picked it up and started doing it myself. And just like you say within the Islamic community. Okay, so there's communal responsibility. But all that's needed is trust. You have to show you're a trustworthy figure. People need to know that there are reasons they're trustworthy. They can trust those resources. So, like if your old children are having problems, say, because I don't know, somebody told if Darwinian evolution is true, that God or something, or the universe is past eternity, even Hawking. You just need to know where the resources are. What I find, especially with others and friends, just that knowledge is enough. Because one of the things that also coherence of theism is that a worldview with a belief in God, the Abrahamic faith, it just fits. It feels very, because it very well explains the facts of existence. So it appeals to our rational, also our emotion. And that's what I think goes on in the communal role. If you have, just have a few experts that do this, and that is the ministry to the faith community. There's a ministry that has to take place also to the outside world, to people who don't believe. So in Christianity, we have the great gospel of Matthew, which says, "Go forth and make believers for all the nations." And I think Islam is also a prospect of religion. So, and we're very close. We're joined at Abraham faith. So, yes, there is a role for that. Is there a role? There's a role for apologetics. Apologetics is, let's see, there's a great quote that William Lane Craig used from a theologian named J. Gresham Machen, who said this. He said, when you're reaching out to a community, it must be true that your claims you're saying about God and Islam or Christianity, that it is a live intellectual option for that community that you're trying to reach. Because if that isn't true, then the barriers that you have to overcome to try to get through to them are so great that all you will get is few stragglers. Like, for example, modern post-Christian Europe is a lot like that. So it was like, this is an example of a speech that he gave at a university in Portugal, or if you go to the Soviet Union, Russia, either during the Soviet era, where a lot of these generations were just brought up under institutional atheism. You can't reach them. Okay, so the role for apologetics when you're reaching out there in the Coulomb argument is number one, right at the top, is to keep. You're not necessarily going to go out and make all these converts, but what you are going to do is keep your faith as a live intellectual. And this is one of the things that I think is very critical in the United States, or the United Kingdom. There's a lot of countries in the world, a lot of them are Muslims, where the faith in God is still so strong that that's not a threat. But it is a threat in a lot of countries. Today, I mentioned a lot of them. The United States is one of them. Our religiosity in the United States is still very high, but it's dropping every year. Okay? So that's that third audience that you're really trying to reach. And that's why you need arguments like Coulomb. You have to be in a situation where people will take serious, even if they don't convert, at least they're taking it as a live option. So you're just planting the seed. It's called pre-evangelism. So I wonder if you agree with that. Is there a different role in the community that you see?
No, I actually agree with everything you said, actually. It was very well said.
Should we move on to questions and answers then?
Sure.
Well, so if you guys wanted to ask a question, that you put that question in the general voice chat. And then also tag me right after. So for the first question, it was a tweet. Someone tweeted at me, the Kalam, the one that leads to a cause and not much else. And that's if you stop caring about the nonsensicality of terms like before time. Question, but it's more like a comment, but obviously you can object to that. So Jibran, do you want to answer this one first?
Is it that it just leads to a cause and not the first cause?
Leads to a cause, like at the end of it all, the conclusion is that the universe has a cause, right?
But it doesn't go beyond that?
That's what he says, like that's like a kind of an objection to it. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think you have to understand, I think he's misunderstanding between the Leibnizian and the Coulomb used from a metric beginning, sure, and that leads to a cause, compared to, a Thomistic or a Leibnizian cosmological argument, which argues for a topological beginning or first member. But I don't understand Why is that a problem? Is there a problem with metric beginning? Is there lead to a cause? Do we not infer God from this?
Yeah, he's saying
understand it.
I think he's saying that it only proves the cause.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay, but I mean, the thing is that we can make causal inference. If we know something is a cause, we can infer some properties. And then from those properties, we can infer a cause. Right? So let's say, for example, since we know the cause proceeds, from space and time, right? Precedes space and time, then it has to be spaceless and timeless. And of course, if it's timeless, then it's immutable. It can't change, right? Since time is basically a series of events, right? So I mean, those are valid interpretations, valid inferences. I mean, and then arguing for a personal cause, I gave 3 arguments for why that has to be the case. And I think those are good and strong arguments.
You want us to just summarize those 3 arguments just really, really quickly?
Things either have a physical explanation or a agent explanation, but it can't be a physical explanation because there is no physical state. So then, by disjunctive syllogism, we can infer that it must be an agent. Second is that the cause, in philosophical literature, there's really 2 types, 2 concepts that fit the category of being, timeless, transcendent, and immaterial. And that would be abstract objects or an immaterial mind or disembodied mind. Now, it can't be an abstract object because, the cause of the universe has to have some kind of power. But abstract objects don't have any sort of power. Number 5, for example, won't cause anything. And the third is, it's the only way to explain how you can have an eternal cause with a finite effect. Because if the cause is sufficient to create the universe, and it's a mechanical cause, then it makes no sense to posit that, the cause wouldn't happen. And then, so those are the arguments that I gave.
I mean, yeah, and I think that's very well explained. That what I call the simple Coulomb argument will just say that flat out, yeah, that there is a cause. And then there's a corollary to that. Like, for example, the article that I co-wrote with WLC, this is the last part of it, where he goes into, what can you infer about who the cause is? And there's a lot of things that you can infer, which you just pointed out, many of them you just pointed out. But I don't have a problem with a limitation to Coulomb because that's not all we have. Okay, there are other arguments. I mentioned the fine-tuning design argument, for example. Yeah, or even the modern argument that if you look at what Dr. Fazal Rana from Reasons to Believe, he has a modern day argument to replace the Paley watchmaker argument. Remember William Paley, who said, if I found a watch on the beach, I wouldn't infer that it was by accident. He was using an analogy between that and life, and that has some weaknesses to it because it's an analogy-based argument. Well, what Fazal Rana argues today is that let's just look at what is going on in the cell. It is not an analogical argument between what is going on in the cell and actual machines that human beings build. It just is a machine. It is that thing. If we actually look at the intricate structures, we see that there's these remarkable designs. I mean, that's more of an intuitional argument because, what I say is there you can see the personhood of the creator. It's a little bit more abstract in the case of the cosmological, the cosmic design argument with the fine tuning, but it's still there also. It shows the design. But there's so many different arguments that we have, and we don't have to tie our arms behind our back. It's not just these rational arguments. There's also revelation. There's a place for revelation. Okay, so how does God talk to us? Well, God answers a lot of these questions, and He reveals a lot about who He is and who we are, and why we're here, and what's going to happen. Where I don't need a Coulomb argument to lead me there. So there's no reason for us to tie our hands behind our back and talk only about the Coulomb argument. It's okay if it has limited implications, because just demonstrating the transcendence of God is pretty cool.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. So this is from Meaning of Durkastan. This is for Sinclair and Jibran. How can a scientific anti-realist reconcile the Kalam Cosmological argument?
I mean, first I would respond to that is people often bring a lot of focus on the scientific arguments, but even if you are, for example, anti-realist, it does nothing to explain the philosophical arguments against an actual infinity or the completion of an infinity by adding finite numbers. So, I mean, even if, you say that, there are no scientific proofs, or maybe I don't accept them as reality, or they explain reality in some way, that's perfectly fine. It's still unreasonable with us given, these philosophical arguments. It's not just, quantum mechanics and Big Bang singularity. That's not the only thing right in the Coulomb.
Yeah, I'm still not fully grasping the question. Is he talking about a different theory of truth and where you get it from?
Well, scientific anti-realism is the belief that scientific theories don't represent reality or the real world. So they're merely constructs that we create to understand the world.
So, yeah, it sounds like it is an objection to the correspondence theory of truth. Actually, in Stephen Hawking's one of his last books with Leonard Mlodinow, he seemed to be arguing in favor of something of a philosophical position called ontological pluralism, which is that scientific models don't necessarily get at the truth of the thing under them. It's not actually pointing to a true ontology. This is what I was talking about with instrumental models early on. What Hawking was saying in that book is that if he had two models, it's kind of like the Ptolemaic theory, the heliocentric. Go back to that again. He said, hey, if they both work, then they're fine. Okay, I may prefer one to the other because it's easier to use. But heck, he even came out, as I recall, Hawking in that book said, I don't even have a problem with young Earth creationists. their theory of the universe being just a couple thousand years old. He said that maybe that model is harder to use and more difficult. However, it came out, the way that they explained it came out in this confused sense, as if they were saying, not that nothing is true, but that all these things are true simultaneously, which Craig argued was an absurd position. So I can't say this. If you're trying to argue, if you're trying to have a discussion with a person who doesn't accept a corresponding theory of truth, which is that we can do induction, we can go out and observe evidence and form conclusions and actually make reasonable inferences about what's happening in the real world. People of that type do have a lot of difficulty with these arguments, but as Jibran said, there's a lot of arguments, like the straight ontological argument, for example, which are logic-based, that they're not about observation and science and all that. And perhaps a argument like that would be more appealing to a person like that. The last thing I'll say about it is all the competitors of the correspondence theory of the truth, I think, came after the 20th century. I would say that's kind of telling as to why that is. To me, I don't want to attack the belief systems, but I don't think there's justification for going. I'll just say that there isn't a good justification for abandoning the correspondence theory of truth, in my view.
So, has asked this question. A question to Sinclair and Jibran. How does the Kalam cosmological argument conclude that the universe came into existence? Scientific theories like the Big Bang, right? Because we know that science can change, like it changes over time, right? So, be that at one point, the Big Bang, well, it could be like tossed out of the window at some point. There's a possibility. So, how can we keep the Kalam cosmological argument independent from theories like the Big Bang?
Okay, I take this one because I love this argument.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I want to know what Jibran thinks about it. There's a great article written by Isaac Asimov. He's now deceased. You know, he's a great science fiction writer, but he was also a popularizer of science. It's called The Relativity of Wrong. And in it, he just eviscerates this idea that you never learn anything that is true. That what actually happens is theories get more refined over time. So we might start with Newtonian gravity. That's wrong because there's a weird thing of the precession of the planet Mercury in its orbit. So then Einstein comes along and no, it's general relativity, and he explains what's going on with Mercury and a bunch of other phenomena. And then we discover that general relativity is wrong. It breaks down times early and something like that. Near black holes, when you get the high curvature. So it's got to be quantum gravity. These theories, but do we throw them out? No, you don't. What you're doing is you're just and you're filling in the loopholes over the, and that's usually what happens in science.
I'm sorry, James, you're cutting out frequently. Could you restate that last bit?
And so what usually happens in science, theories get more refined over time. It's not that they're thrown out. So it's not that Isaac Newton was wrong about his theory of gravity and therefore it's useless. Okay, heck, they still use Newton's theory to send satellites to all the local planets. That's how accurate it is. So the fact that Einstein, okay, he has general relativity. Oh, but are we actually throwing that out? This is an argument you face for Coulomb often. Okay, why are you talking about general relativity when we know that's a wrong? There's quantum gravity. And in fact, it's extremely accurate, and it makes good predictions. And you don't throw out all the knowledge that will happen in quantum gravity will be on top of that, where you learn about the high curvature areas. So you'll be able to learn things, what thing to learn. But it's not true that science is the theory of the moment you're throwing. All we're doing is we start with so I recommend that article. Go Google it. Say Isaac Asimov, The Relativity of Wrong. It's available.
How does the Kalam cosmological argument conclude that the universe came into existence without using scientific theories like the Big Bang?
Those generally do with paradoxes that would occur if infinities were to exist, right? So if the universe were eternal, that would mean that the number of past events in the universe would be infinity. But the thing is that we give things infinite properties, right? Or the property of being infinite, result in paradoxes. One such example is Hilbert's Hotel, Bennedart's book. Like like I said earlier, Benedict imagines, imagine if there was a book, right, that has one page and then another page next to it, and this goes on forever, right? And each page, loses its thickness by half, right? Now, if you were to close the book and then turn to the back side of the book and open the last page, there would be no last page, right? There would be no page at the end of the book. And that kind of thing is just straight up absurd. Hilbert Hotel, right? If you take in, you can have a guest, infinite amount of rooms, infinite amount of guests, and yet you could still have an infinite amount of people in that room, even though all the rooms are occupied by every occupant. And so these kinds of absurdities can't really exist. Another argument also used is that you can't reach an infinity by adding one member to another. And as Sinclair used the Tristan Shandy paradox, right? Where imagine a guy who in 1 year he writes 1 day of his life, right? Suppose he went on for infinity. Well, the problem would be that he would be infinitely behind, and so he'd never complete the book, right? Because Bertrand Russell, the one who used the paradox, made the wrong inference. Because he believed that infinite amount of time, Tristram Shandy should complete his book. But as Craig wonderfully argued, no, he wouldn't. He commits a quantifiership fallacy, right? Because he assumes that because there is a year in which he writes a day, there will be a day with all of these, right? And that's a classic textbook case of a quantifiership fallacy.
I mean, the fact that this argument goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, well before even modern scientific practice developed, shows the strength of the argument, just as Jibran just said, that you can make which are very strong. And for certain types of audiences, those are more powerful.
Exactly. Another example is Al-Ghazali, right? Al-Ghazali, I mean, this was before, Big Bang singularity. Argues for the beginning of the universe. And, imagine, for example, Mars and Saturn. No, I mean, Jupiter and Saturn, right? And that for every orbit Jupiter completes, Saturn does 2 more, right? Now, suppose this went on for infinity. Well, what would occur is that, Jupiter and Saturn would have equal amount of orbits, which is absurd. And another example argument the Kalam scholars also used, well, if an infinite past, we would never arrive to the present, because at any moment in time, you would have to cross an infinity amount of moments to get there, right? But since we are in the present moment, the universe has to be finite.
Also, one could potentially respond to that by saying, this is what Ali had tweeted. Without going into too much detail, there are eternal universe models that exist. We published that claim to show how eternal universe models can solve the problem of a first cause. It's beyond the scope of this thread to explain them all. Many mathematicians believe that an actual for an actual infinity to exist. Just because we can't comprehend it doesn't mean that it can't necessarily happen, right?
But the argument isn't that, well, we can't comprehend infinity, therefore infinity can't exist. Well, in fact, I understand that in modern mathematics, set theory is all about actual infinities. Like, you can't have set theory without actual infinity. But the problem here is that all this would prove is that mathematic numbers transpine a numeral, they're just in your head. Because what we mean here when we say an actual infinity can't exist is that it can't exist in the real world, you could say. Like, exist in the same way a ball exists or I exist. It can't have physical existence. So, it could be possible in mathematics that actual infinities exist, but it doesn't involve that it exists in the real world.
Yeah, those physical models, For one thing, we actually read the papers. They almost never talk in terms of actual infinities. I can only think of one offhand by a guy named Frampton, which I talked about one of my articles, where he actually referenced actual infinities. But I don't think, believe it or not, don't think that cosmologists are that sophisticated with regard to these Cantorian ideas of level of infinity you're talking about. So it's the other thing that happens is yes, it's absolutely, papers are published by cosmologists who believe that found the argument of the week for why they have a past eternal universe, and then you just wait a little time, then it turned out not to be true. So it's actually, especially if you read them, it's actually very difficult to envision a model that actually works at showing past eternal universe. That you have to dodge so many books in order to come up with generally there's a singularity. Got something about entropy that you should have considered. And over time these things get ruled out. So I'm not particularly impressed by that claim. That it is true what Ali is saying. We're talking about one smart guy, and he's a great. So I'm not picking on him specifically. But that claim is not nearly as I think. Once you actually put some scrutiny on it.
Not to mention, even suppose that there was a paper, right? It wouldn't necessarily make it, really popular. Because the thing is, scientific papers, they also need to have, the consistency in the results. So there needs to be other papers backing those papers up. So even if you have like one paper, that's not sufficient evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like this situation. You've got a scientific community that's working. It's actually a metaphysical rule. Whether or not they want to say that or not doesn't matter. But they're operating under a metaphysical rule called methodological naturalism. Okay, so what they believe they need to show and need or have physical theory. There's a couple things which scientists really, cosmologists especially, they don't like fine tuning. They don't like beginnings. Okay, and there's another thing called a boundary condition, because that implies that there's some arbitrary conditions, and how do they get set? So Stephen Hawking especially, mentioned him a lot because he was the leader on them. One of the things that I have at the graphic that has a Stephen Hawking quote, I could show anybody the paper that it came from. It's one of his lectures in about 2003 or something. Stephen Hawking compared a past eternal cosmological model. He said the difference in the implications between a past eternal cosmological and a Big Bang model of past time, because he said that you still requires a boundary condition. It just depends on where you put the boundary condition. Can I time ago at the Big Bang, or does it happen, quote unquote, at past infinity? He said, this is Hawking speaking here, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he said either one implies a watchmaker and made the universe. And therefore, he hated past eternal models. And that's because it didn't solve the problem. It doesn't give the explanation. By the way, cosmologists are absolutely believe in the PS. the principle of sufficient reason, because they hate the idea that things can't be explained. That's why they hate fine tuning, hate boundary conditions. So that's why Hawking spent most of his life trying to know boundary. Well, now you know why Brown wanted something where he didn't have to have a separate explanation for why the universe is the way it is, whether it's past eternal or finite. So, yeah, even if you have, that is, by the way, a separate argument. Now, maybe there is a fourth conjugal. I call this the Hawking parody, because I know Hawking meant it parody, the actual cosmological argument. But Hawking would actually argue that past eternal universe is the same thing in perspective. There is a boundary condition when you have a creator, and he did not like that.
So, meaning of Durkastan, he asked a question to Sinclair: have you considered Kuhn's philosophy on scientific progress?
And Popper also. This idea that science progresses, the progression of science is not nearly as plain scientists themselves make it out to be. Like, scientists will absolutely try to protect their theories in the face of contrary evidence. And if they have more influence than other younger scientists who might have better ideas, they will hold sway in the academy for a while. Really, the good thing about it is that after a while, because things are usually testable, the log jam will break and the true ideas will come out. So there's, I would say there is a lot of baggage and dirty laundry. There's other things that happen. People will submit parody or false paper to peer review just to see if they can get them published, to test the peer review process and see how they're pushed. And there'll be a scandal for a while. They say, well, how did you pass peer review with this? But by and large, the system works. You will eventually get past that. I think that the truth does tend to win out. It's just my own impression. The problem comes, and there was a cosmologist named Lee Smoke book a few years ago called The Trouble with Physics. The problem comes when you have a theory like string theory, which I'm fine with string theory. I'm about to criticize necessarily down on. The problem is that now you're starting to talk about episodes in the history of the universe are so high, and it's getting, you can have situations where it's impossible to build tests to see whether the theory is correct or not. And then scientists will the only rules that they'll have available to the simplicity and beauty is various and in that case, a theory which is absolutely wrong can survive and thrive. This is one of the things that Spolin had a problem. He said, there's another guy, I think his name was or something similar. And I think Roger Penrose has this quote. So you're in a dangerous position where you have theories that can't be tested, because then you don't have this self-correction take place. And you can be led down a bad. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to turn, because it often, like I'll give you an example. Multiverse theory. I'm all over multiverse theories because I think that's one of the good objections to the design argument. So that's why I recently co-wrote a paper on that, which is going to be published this year. And I spent my time on that because I thought that was the good objection, so I'm going to face it. But the thing about multiverse theory, and it's now a minority opinion, used to be a majority opinion amongst cosmologists, that you say, well, how the heck are you supposed to test the multiverse theory when you're stuck in one universe? So the problem with the theory isn't that it doesn't explain anything; it explains too much, and there's still a strong community that opposes the idea of multiverses on that basis. And this is just falls into saying, how am I going to test this? But they're surprisingly might be able to come up with some tests which could show whether theories are compatible with a multiverse or not. It's not, the situation is not as bad as we think. And like for example, when we talk about pre-Big Bang theories, that's a case where the Big Bang is an event everyone believes it happened, but it's not a transcendent event. So there's a history of is there, like for example, does information about what the universe was like before the Big Bang persist through the singularity or the quantum, whatever the high curvature quantum region? Does that information survive somehow so that we can see and measure it as present day and actually have a look? In that case, that'd be like a temporal universe, like say a cyclic model, which goes through these high curvature states every so often. It may actually be possible to define tests to measure or say extreme what its predictions are. So I'm still unsettled. We seem to be headed in a direction, but I'm not convinced that science is headed to the cul-de-sac. That's dangerous.
So we actually went nearly an hour over our planned schedule. So, and our guests also have to go and attend to their lives as well, outside of Durkastan. So I just wanted to thank Brother Jibran, as well as Mr. James Sinclair for coming on to the show. Durkastan Halaqa, for coming. And if people want to learn more about you, where can they contact you, and like what kind of books could they read that's associated with you?
Who's the question addressed to?
Oh yeah, this is for both of you. So James, for you first.
I set up that site. It's just Jason. Not a fancy name. He said if you just go onto Twitter and search that term, Coulomb or something, you'll find. I set that up and this is one of my efforts to help the faith community, and that now, hopefully that's an alliance between Christians and Muslims. I love you guys. I go into a lot of extended arguments. I have some presentations that they've posted. All you gotta do is go to my pinned tweet and get into it, and you will find presentations on the Coulomb argument, as well as the fine-tuning argument. And that's for you. That's a resource that's available for you. And I answer DMs. So when I have the time, I have a day job in the family. I tend to be busy, but I love interacting with you. So by all means, come to me and ask questions if you like. I'm also JasonClaire006@gmail.com. And Jibran, if you want me to send you that paper, you can send me an email and I'll send it. Remember the one I mentioned last night? I can send that to you.
Alright, I would love that.
So if you want to find him on Twitter, it's at JSINCLA 434-77730.
Yeah, they gave me this ridiculously long and difficult name, and I wasn't smart enough to change it.
As for Jibran, where can people find you?
You should find me here on Discord. I mean, I do have a Twitter, but I never use it. I haven't posted anything on it either. Right? I'm usually here when I'm usually free from for studying or done reading or any of that. So if you just want to contact me, just find me here on this Discord.
Cool. Alhamdulillah. Usually Muslims, we conclude our gatherings with Surah Al-Asr. So I'll just recite that and then we'll be done. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal-Asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil-haqqi wa tawasaw bis-sabr. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Thank you guys so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me.